Tesh. We like to think of the United States as the land of the free, the cradle of liberty, the champion of human rights and democracy around the world. We respond with sympathy and outrage to scenes of demonstrators for freedom being tear-gassed and beaten in the streets of foreign cities, or unarmed prisoners being murdered in Bosnia, a young person thrown in a windowless cell and held without any communication in Turkey, or female prisoners tortured and raped by the troops of some military junta in Latin America. So it's difficult to acknowledge that similar travesties of justice occur every day in communities and prisons across this country. As a percentage of the population, we have more people in prison in this country than all but 2 other countries in the world. We have 6 times as many people in prison as in England or in communist China, 8 times as many as in Germany, and that number continues to rise. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people are added to the prison rolls, partly as a result of the war on drugs and mandatory sentencing policies. Of those 1.7 million and counting upward prisoners in this country, many suffer in unnecessarily harsh and illegal conditions. They struggle to maintain hope, their sanity, and their humanity in the face of degradation, beatings, rape, increased isolation, and the threat of death. Tonight we look at the dark side of human rights in the United States, the criminal justice system, and its effect on the lives of prisoners, their families, and our community. We're lucky tonight to have 5 people as our guests in the studio who have graciously agreed to share their experiences working with prisoners inside and outside of prison. I'd like to introduce them now. First, Josh Rubenstein is the director of the New England Regional Director of Amnesty International.
Yes, hi Charlie, good to be here.
Thank you for coming. Barbara Jane, who is a former inmate at MCI Framingham.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. Renee Warmack Keels is a Baptist minister,
Yes.
the organizer of, is it Social Justice for Women?
No, I'm no longer with that organization. I organized a support group for mothers who have sons and daughters in prison called the Silent Warriors.
Silent Warriors, that's right. Thank you. Kazi Toure is with the Criminal Justice Program, the American Friends Service Committee. Thanks for coming, Kazi.
Thank you, Cal.
And Philip Castle from the Massachusetts Correctional Legal Services.
Hi, Charlie. How are you?
Good. Let me start with you, Josh. I heard you on the radio recently. Amnesty International has started a campaign for human rights in the United States. Why don't you start us off by describing what Amnesty is about and then how this program got going.
Right. Amnesty is a worldwide movement that focuses on prisoners of conscience, on people who are in jail for their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, who have not used or advocated violence. We also work against torture and the death penalty. Increasingly, Amnesty has been concerned about prison conditions in the United States, even as they relate to ordinary criminals, because we feel that so often conditions in these places of detention violate international standards of how prisoners should be treated. For example, in the report, Rights for All, we focus on the treatment of women prisoners who often are subjected to various physical and sexual abuse in prison. In fact, in Michigan, the federal government has brought suit against the state prison system in Michigan because women there have suffered systematic sexual abuse. They've been threatened and harassed simply for talking to federal officers about what happened in Michigan, and that's part of Amnesty's report. This report was issued on October 6th, and it's part of an international campaign, which means that Amnesty members throughout Europe and Asia and Latin America, as well as here in the United States, will be writing to U.S. officials, to state officials, insisting that international standards of proper behavior relate to police brutality, the treatment of prisoners in American jails and prisons, the detention of people seeking asylum here who are placed under indefinite detention, often in county jails, and issues associated with these issues form the heart of our campaign for human rights here in the United States.
That's a pretty broad spectrum. How did you, was there an occasion that got you started on this?
Amnesty International. Well,
Yeah.
keep in mind, we have always, people associate our work with opposition to the death penalty. We issued major reports on police brutality in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and in New York in recent years. I think it reached a point where we were pulling these issues together, and we realized that a pattern was emerging, that certain categories of people in the United States, detained asylum seekers, people convicted of certain crimes, women in jail, people subjected to police brutality, that somehow they were not having the protection of equal justice under law that the rest of us routinely assume in our day-to-day lives, that somehow they were outside of legal protection. And when you put this together in a report, chapter by chapter, I think this pattern emerges. And so Amnesty decided it was time to focus attention even on this democratic and open society, and that's what we're doing.
Other people can, please feel free to join in, but so let's focus a little bit on the conditions in prison now.
Well, obviously, we're talking about, as you mentioned, 1.7 million people in jail across the country, and our friends here at this table have experienced visiting and spending time in jails here in Massachusetts and understand that there are certain abuses that take place in terms of use of isolation, sexual abuse by guards, verbal and physical abuse and harassment that simply should be prohibited.
All of these things are illegal, aren't they?
No, they're not. In fact, Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court recently issued a ruling called Torres versus the Commonwealth, I believe, in which they said detention and isolation, total isolation for up to 10 years is totally legal. It is not cruel and unusual punishment. It has their blessing.
But isolation is a standard way to torture somebody. You drive somebody crazy by completely
Yes, it
isolating
is. And
them.
you also have to ask yourself, what could a person in jail possibly do that did not warrant going out to court? Okay, it was not a crime, it wasn't a stabbing, it wasn't a beating, it wasn't a rape. But is important enough to the Department of Corrections that that person must live in a room by themselves for up to 10 years.
This was not part of their original sentence. They weren't sentenced to solitary confinement
No.
for 10 years.
But there has been, just recently, a judge just sentenced two different people to life in isolation.
Where was this? Here? Do you remember?
No, I read it a couple days ago. I
Well,
don't know what state.
I think that's just giving evidence to the increasing idea that it's okay, that being in prison, being incarcerated, being in jail is not just punishment enough for whatever crime you've committed, but that some other level of punishment also needs to be inflicted. And I think the things that I've been hearing from prisoners that I work with, it's beginning to escalate, and we who are in the system don't always get to see it, but we hear it from the people that we work with. And when we raise those issues to people in the community at large, the position seems to be that it's okay for them to have even more harsher and more cruel punishment because they're these horrible individuals who've done these horrible things. And that's not to say that it is not right to punish people who have committed crimes, but there has to be some balance between when we cross the line. We know that all types of brutality do exist, but somehow or other we have adopted the opinion that it's okay to even be more brutal.
In fact, excuse me, Massachusetts law, just to put a little finer point on what you're saying, Barbara, Massachusetts law does prohibit the use of segregation conditions under regulation unless a prisoner is deemed to be a substantial threat to institutional security. Those regulations are ignored. And recently, a Superior Court judge said that it's illegal for the Department of Correction to continue to ignore these regulations. That case is pending on appeal. In fact, many prisoners who have good prison conduct records, who have not committed serious crimes, who are in a mandatory drug 5-year mandatory minimum drug crimes, are held in long-term segregation conditions at the state maximum security prison in Walpole. And in fact, an expert in a case in which I'm litigating a 22-year maximum security warden severely criticized the practices of the Department of Correction and said that after reviewing 200 prisoner files drawn from a sample of 486 prisoners, that prisoners who are confined in administrative segregation long-term in their cells, day in and day out, under conditions that are cruel and psychologically devastating, cannot be distinguished from your average medium security prisoner. In fact, the department's own scoring classification policy confirms that judgment.
And
What do you mean they can't be distinguished?
In other words, the average prisoner in administrative segregation at Walpole has the characteristics of the average prisoner who is maintained in a medium security prisoner, where they're out of their cells, able to engage in at least some minimal amount of programming, where they're not confined, where they potentially can work at least.
So they're basically just denying the effect that being in this kind of containment has on people.
Well, they're doing a couple things. One is that in order to continue to build more maximum security beds and allow minimum security beds that prisoners are clearly eligible for under their own policies to remain vacant, they overclassify prisoners. Their own research demonstrates this. Their own scoring policies demonstrate that the average prisoner, they have in administrative segregation for long periods of time under their own scoring regimen, and this is upon a review of hundreds of files.
Okay.
And Phil, we've been hearing this for the last 4 or 5 years.
That's
I mean, this is not the first time that I've heard this. I hear it over and over again, and particularly from the researcher who used to be with the Department of Corrections.
they just transferred 200 people from Walpole and 400 from, I think, from Bridgewater to the new
To Shirley?
to Shirley, to the
Shirley's
new
full now,
isolation.
isn't
Yeah,
it?
I was just about, and they just gasped.
Amazing.
They
You
just
have
gasped, and
400
it was.
prisoners who are in SECC.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's cool. It's cool, man.
There are 400 prisoners who are SECC 1-day or medium security prisoners.
Level 4.
And public safety does not require that they be in their cells 100% of the time or 95% of the time. And the next day, they're transferred to a new prison where they're treated as animals.
Legislation.
Because we have the beds.
legislature-
And in higher
Right.
security.
The legislature
security.
cons poor communities into letting these facilities be built by giving them a $10,000 bounty for every secure bed they let them build. But if you let them have a minimum or work release facility or even a less secure reintegration type facility, you get nothing.
How many beds are there in this?
1,200.
1,200.
1,200 in Shirley.
Times 10,000 is a lot of money.
That's just like goes into the city treasury, something like that?
I know at one point the legislature was discussing that there should be limits on what they would let these towns do with the money, that it had to be used for the public good or public work. I lost track of it after that.
In the past, I've heard a lot of communities not wanting to have a prison facility sited in their town or near their town.
For many
Yeah.
of these communities, the prison is the only employer. And corrections has gone from people don't want it in their backyard into it being one of the most desirable industries to have in your town. They will never close a prison down.
Some time ago, they exported a bunch of prisoners down to Texas.
Yes.
That was
Yes.
300.
And now I've heard that even though they've opened a new facility here, they haven't brought those prisoners
No,
back.
and they
Is
will
that
not be
right?
coming back.
They won't be coming back?
They will not.
What, is there a policy on that, or why is that happening?
Yeah, there is a policy. What they're doing is, it started out as 2 years. Now it's 1. I believe it's 1 year.
I thought it started out as 1 year or less, that if you had less than 1 year of time to serve, that you would be sent there. It wasn't for anyone who had any more time than 1 year or 12 months. So you're telling me that
No.
it's even increased?
Yeah. Now, that's how long they're leaving people down. They're bringing some people back. Then bring people back, they take another busload down.
And were
You
these,
know, it's making money.
what category of prisoners were these that were sent to Texas?
Well, the first buses that went out were all sex offenders. You know, they felt that there wouldn't be an outcry against sex offenders. Nobody would say anything about them. But now it's open. They're sending
So anyone
Yeah,
is
they're
subject.
sending people with life sentences.
Yeah, and they're housed in the Dallas County Jail. They're not in
In a
Texas.
county jail.
Yes.
Yeah, they're in a bubble. They're in bubbles like quads, like there's 8 people in a bubble that stay in this bubble all day.
Mhm.
Well, I hear the impact of that on families, particularly mothers who have sons and daughters who are locked up and suddenly find out one day that their child has been sent to Texas. That means there's no visitation. That means long-distance telephone calls. The cost of those calls increase. I mean, that's having a devastating effect on families, and as I understand, mission of corrections to rehabilitate and provide persons with the opportunity to maintain those ties is a clear violation of their own mission.
Well,
That's one of the fallacies that criminal justice clings to so strongly. The fact that treating people brutally day after day after day, in fact, somehow at the end when that person comes up, they'll be a
They're
better
person.
citizen.
yeah.
And it's just not possible.
Where is this idea coming from? I mean, if you think of being a parent, for example, you have a child and everyone knows that you want your child, to grow up well. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be, it needs to be taken care of. It needs to be treated with respect. How can you make someone, change in a better way by doing the things that are happening to them in prison today?
I don't think.
That's not the purpose.
Yeah, I don't think
That's
that's
the
what
purpose.
is. I think that's what they sell to the public, and what they're really doing is making money and increasing just the probability that people will come back. They're trying to break people down, dehumanize them, break their spirits, leave them in long-term isolation, and let them come out as broken human beings back into the public, and then with no money, no place to go. A lot of people end up in shelters, and a lot of people end up going back.
And no vote.
You're
basically
it's
crossed
really
off the
insidious.
page.
Uh-huh.
You're basically crossed off the page.
What's the motivation for this? Why are they doing this?
I heard the most frightening interview on the radio, and it was the state representative that introduced the bill to limit inmates voting, and he made the totally erroneous and scary statement that voting was a privilege and only good citizens should be allowed to vote. Voting is not a privilege, it's a right guaranteed under the Constitution. And how do you define a good citizen? White man makes more than $50,000 a year? Or is it the guy that contributes to the political party that's currently in power? I think how voting was when the United States first joined, where you had to be a landowner. Or you had to be a church member. There was a way to cut people who you were afraid might oppose your policies out of the equation. And I really see this as just the same thing.
So
When's it going to be
so
welfare mothers
racism.
next? People
So-
with HIV, who's next? If you let one vulnerable group get cut out because really they don't count, well, I guarantee you another group's going to follow, and someday it's going to be you.
but I would think I just want to interject this to answer that, to add on to it. I think racism is a sole reason why they're doing it. I mean, if you look at who's in prison, it can tell. And
Poor people and
it's
people
poor
of
people.
color.
That's all that's in
And they also
prison.
try to segregate, now that more middle-class people are going to jail because they're criminalizing behavior, they really try to segregate out middle-class, well-educated people. Oh, you go to Longwood for alcohol treatment. Oh, you go to minimum, within a month. Hard time is for black people. Hard time is for people who don't speak English. Hard time is for people who are going to be deported after serving their 15 years mandatory. And of course, spend another 5 years in an INS jail.
You mentioned.
They're afraid people are going to look, see, and tell.
Mhm. You mentioned mandatory sentencing guidelines earlier when we were talking as one of the mechanisms that makes that happen. Can you explain that?
Phrase your question differently.
Okay. It was the if an offense is committed within such a distance of a schoolyard or whatever, that if a white person, say, does is caught with drugs, they'll get 5 years. If it's a black person or someone who doesn't speak English well, they'll get 7.5 years.
Yes, we have a mandatory sentencing in a law called school zone. And I don't think people get up in the morning and say, what can we do that will hurt people? I think the motive behind making the school zone laws was to protect school children. And that certainly is a worthy thing. Our society should protect its children of all colors. But what happened with the school zone, because almost every single place in Massachusetts is within 1,500 feet of a school or a park or a playground, the application of that charge is at the discretion of the prosecutor. And just from the people that I know at MCI Framingham, I didn't know a single white person who had that. You were either black or you spoke English with an accent. And that's at the discretion of your prosecutor.
Just in terms of, we were talking generally about why it is that there's so much momentum behind criminal justice policy that really doesn't make much sense in terms of turning out people into the community who have not been rehabilitated or who are more of a threat, not taking advantage of the opportunity to give people a chance to move from a life of crime. And a number of factors which I think are very key were mentioned, such as racism, but I think we also have to look closely at the nature of political discourse in this country and the fact that there's no area where the range of acceptable political thought is so narrow as in the area of criminal justice. I mean, I heard Tom Birmingham speak once to a group of people who are interested in criminal justice issues, and he said, look, there's consensus among the Democrats in this state that mandatory sentencing makes little sense, but there's also no momentum to do anything about it because everyone's afraid about getting elected. And to the extent that people cater to a fear that they've created, an irrational fear perhaps of crime, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it builds momentum, and it just spirals, and it's spiraling out of control to the point where we're spending more on on prisons than higher education in many states.
This seems to make so little sense that I wonder how it can keep going. I mean, the idea that you can treat someone so bad that they're just going to get better or something. I mean, this doesn't make sense. How can politicians continue to get political mileage out of a line like that?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons, but as you've alluded to, certainly prisons are big business today. Before, I guess, the issue of privatization came along, people in prison had the opportunity to earn at least some type of income doing something or other, various jobs in prison industry. And now I heard something a couple of years ago down at Old Colony, for example. Prisoners are allowed to have televisions. And if there's a two-person cell, then each person has a desk, and their TV sits on their desk. Well, at Old Colony, a couple of years ago, they suddenly decided that it was no longer okay to sit the television on the desk, that now they had to have some kind of stand or something that came out of the wall on which the television was to sit on. Well, that was a contract for somebody. That meant not only the stand or whatever it is that comes out of the wall to hold the TV, it means the purchasing of all of those, it means the installation of that. And so that's a contract for someone. And I think we can look back over the last 5 or 6 years and begin to see how other individuals are getting wealthy or making money on the prison system. It is the largest growing industry in this country. And I think we have to ask the other kind of question is what's happening in terms of our economy in the United States. We send a lot of our manufacturing out of the country, which means that people here have less opportunity for what we considered 25 or 30 years ago, those entry-level jobs into manufacturing and what have you. Those jobs are no longer there. But you're very, very correct on the prison being the place where people can work, send their children to college, buy their middle-class homes, do all the things that they could not have done before in the manufacturing industry. So I think that's a key thing that is fueling the prison industry.
And a lot of those jobs are going inside. A lot of those low entry jobs are going inside. Maybe not in Massachusetts, but in other states, and especially in the federal joints.
I'd like to expand on that. You know, I know recently with the stock market instability, there's been so much media that, oh, the economy is so good. Well, if you look at the last 20 years, the top 10% are making 50% more, and the bottom 10% are making 1.5% more, and yet they're convincing you, oh, this economy is so good. It's like people want to tell me what a great president we have, but I look at a guy who signed a death penalty act. I looked at a guy who added 50 federal charges that you can be given the death penalty for, and a guy who basically shipped almost all of American manufacturing to Mexico. And then I see this tiny little article in the back of the newspaper, and it says there's a trade deficit now, $1.5 billion, and who's the number one partner? Mexico. Mexico. Jail is war on the poor. That's why if you look at the rates of incarceration among women and children, on who the burden of poverty in America falls on, the rates are phenomenal. They far outstrip any other criminal group. It's war on the poor.
The number of women in prison in Massachusetts has increased hugely over the last
Phenomenally.
20 years or so.
Well, that fits a national
Substantial.
pattern. There are more women in jail across the country than ever before, about 700,000 in prisons, jails, county jails, local jails, and they're not being treated properly. Amnesty documented cases where women who were pregnant were in shackles, even to the point of when they were giving labor, when they were in labor. We have situations where there are facilities with 800 or 900 women in them and no gynecologist on staff. So there's this medical abuse of women when they have particular medical needs, and the system is indifferent to those needs. And that's appalling.
Yes, it is.
Many women are incarcerated on mandatory drug infractions. It's well documented that those who are lowest on the totem pole, you know, in terms of a drug enterprise, are most likely to be caught up in a mandatory sentence because they don't have information to trade. Because drug enterprises are as sexist as the rest of the world, women are quite often, you know, at the bottom of the totem, and they're the ones that get stuck holding the drugs for someone else and nailed with a mandatory sentence because they don't have any information to trade in order to get out from under it. So you have the vast majority of women prisoners are nonviolent, and yet they're held in places like Framingham where you know, you have guards treating them like they're some sort of serious threat. It's run like a military camp. And there's this tremendous abuse that goes on there, and completely unnecessary punitive attitude.
Well, you know, a couple of years ago, as they were building, I think it's the new facility in Hamden, that they made sure that there was a separate space for women. And because it was predominantly a male population that was there, that the women were only allowed to come out at certain times because they didn't want the men to see them or whatever. So the women then were even further restricted in terms of how they were able to come out and use the recreational facilities, or at least to be able to get exercise. And so I found that to be absolutely appalling. So the women had experienced yet another type of discrimination against, because they were tended to be small numbers in the county facilities, and they received less of the programs than anything that possibly is available to the predominantly male population. And
I think another thing, because of people's prejudices and expectations of what feminine behavior is, I think a lot of times when the court sees women who maybe did not behave in a traditional female role, they really crack down on hard time. So frequently, the woman who's serving first-degree life, you can find a man with a comparable crime who is in fact serving manslaughter. And women who are guilty of assault and battery are usually serving the max. But a man who's serving assault and battery probably got 2 months, if he even got jail at all. It's the same thing with domestic violence. Your husband can beat you up. That's assault and battery, but that's not what he's charged with. He's charged under domestic violence statutes. He punches you and you kick him back, you're going to jail too. That's called assault with intent to kill, assault with a deadly weapon, a shod foot. Who's going to get the more time? Well, men lose their temper, but women are supposed to take it. And I think that's a factor that's always in a very subtle way operating in the back of the court's mind. I'm not saying they go out of their way to be prejudicial. I think that we all have ideas of how we think different people are going to
I
act.
think we disagree over here. They do go
Tell
out of their
me.
way.
Tell
They
me
do go
all
out of
about
their
it.
way to be prejudicial.
Disagree.
I do. I think that you know, as we talk about what type of discretion that happens from the very moment that a person is even charged with an offense, all the way up to when that person is found guilty and sentenced. That yes, I believe prejudice enters into the case at every nook and cranny. My experience in the criminal justice system has been just an incredible, profound thing, from losing my father in the prison system to now having my son be incarcerated, and to see the prejudice that my family experienced because we were poor and because we were African Americans. And I mean, just to see that so blatantly, you know, I always thought that this was the place where we received equal treatment and equal justice, but it's just not true.
How did
A whole lot of people feel like that.
It's just not true.
No, I mean, really, I think the United States government, you know, has hoodwinked the majority of the populace in this country into thinking, well, you know, like, we really need to lock these people up. Everybody has equal rights. Everybody, you know, and it's just not true. When I went to trial, they put a bug in the courtroom between me and my lawyer. The Supreme Court in Massachusetts ruled that it was illegal bugging of the courtroom, because it's supposed to be the people's court. But they said because I had to prove what was on the tape that the feds got and the Massachusetts State Police got led to my conviction, but they wouldn't give me the tape. You know.
Did they allow you to listen to it?
That's no.
That's prejudicial.
You know, and they did it right here.
Yeah.
You know, but the majority of people don't hear about these things, and they don't hear about what's going on, because the newspapers and the media is controlled by a few families, and they're from
Guys
ruling class.
whose incomes
you
have
know.
gone up 50%.
Right.
or-
So it's in their interest to keep the rest of the people blind to what's going on, and people have to really dig to find out what's going on and why this is happening. So then they can pump up on the news and flash, you know, young black kids or young Hispanic
Yes,
kids in
you should be
hoodies and
scared of
whatnot,
these people.
and they create an image. They package it, put it out, and make people feel like, yeah, we got to put more police on the streets. We got to build more penitentiaries to lock all these people up. Everybody says, yeah, you're right. You know.
I think Kazi brought up a real important point. The fact is, although you do have rights under the law, more and more the court is saying, yes, you do have rights under the law, but no, we won't do anything to help you with them. And I find that extremely disturbing. Extremely disturbing.
Before we get off the point of bigotry, I feel like I need to jump in with a little bit of discussion of what's going on in Massachusetts prisons today towards the Latinos. Over half the prisoners in the custody of the Department of Correction have been labeled as gang affiliated, and practically a quarter of the prison population, whereas only a few years ago, the Mass DOC reported to a national survey that there were 2 prison gangs and only several members in the whole state. Suddenly, there's 25% of the prison population is labeled as gang members. 90% of those who suffer the most severe consequence of that who are locked up, you know, virtually around the clock. And some days they don't get outside at all. Or they don't get outside except only one hour every 5 days. They're out of their cells for 3 hours in every 5 days, 1 hour per.
Is this mostly in Cedar Junction?
Mostly Cedar Junction, but it's also occurring around the state. 90% of them are
It's going to
Latinos.
happen at Shirley now, too, won't it?
It's not clear. It's not clear how they're going to use that prison. So far, they haven't moved the so-called gang blocks. But over 90% of the prisoners who are maintained in those circumstances are Latinos. And again, you look at their prison conduct records, many of them are clean. In fact, their average classification score, which is supposed to factor those things that are predictive of your conduct in prison, and they reflect your conduct in the past, both your crime and as well as, you know, how you've behaved in prison. Their scores are less than the average of a medium security prisoner. We've heard story after story of persons saying, basically, I was just talking to some people. I'm an older prisoner. I mentor younger prisoners. They come to me for advice because I've been around. Well, the correctional authorities, they seem to label someone as a gang member automatically when they're seen talking in Spanish.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's a very grave situation.
You know, I'm just thinking here, I feel like I'm sitting with friends and we've had these conversations for forever and a day. I would like to just sort of ask you, Charlie, that since we raised this issue of the Amnesty International report and the issue of human rights, is a question that perhaps maybe all of us can ponder, and that is, how do we call attention to the extreme violation of human rights of prisoners? I mean, this for me is like preaching to the choir, but to move it beyond just talking among friends.
Right.
This is the issue that I hope that we can talk about in a way that says, what can we do? How do we call attention to the fact that on a daily basis that prisoners are being denied their very basic human rights, and because they're prisoners does not render them inhuman?
Right. I mean, I think we're answering your question right now. I mean, well,
I don't
Yeah.
see any answers there.
well, you people are talking among friends, but we're also sharing all of this with our audience throughout the city and several other cities.
Do you
So
think anyone will call?
I think to take
If we
yours
have
just
the phone
one
number they
step
want,
further,
we can do
Renee,
that.
and it's a question of going beyond the human rights and going to the abolition of prisons altogether. Because in the mid-'70s, the prison population was dropping like about 1% a year. And there was people talking about finding different solutions to locking people up and locking people in isolation and having them tortured and whatnot. The people were talking about bringing people back to the community whole, finding out what made people do the crimes, so-called social crimes or whatever that they've done, and bring them back healed. All the education programs. I mean, we have to start moving to the abolition of prisons altogether, because it all starts, somewhere else in the prevention, in the education, in the family, and all that starts in society. So
Yeah, I have to agree with Kazi. I think right now we do have a lowered crime rate, not because so many people are in jail, but I think because of the aging of the baby boomers. And I think coming up right behind him is another big lump of population. And I know children in particular and young people are being treated with incredible brutality in the criminal justice system. They'll spend $30,000 a year to keep a nonviolent person in prison, but if you said, could I have $30,000 to go to college, they wouldn't get that, nor would your high school be rebuilt, nor would you be in class sizes that are small enough where a child could actually learn something.
Well, when you look at the repeal of the Pell Grants for prisoners, and I think Boston University had documented about 5 or 6 years ago that for the prisoner who attains additional education, whether it's that GED or that bachelor's degree, that the likelihood of recidivism begins to lower significantly. We know that. We know that works. So I would ask that same question. Why are we so willing to pay that $30,000 or $40,000 to incarcerate that person for 10 or 12 or 15 years when we could pay $15,000 and send that person and use that for what we were using?
Let me suggest that that's an argument, and the attendant arguments around that all of us in our communities need to start making. If we just remind the public that prisons are brutal places, I think, unfortunately, our fellow citizens, by and large, will respond with indifference. They know they're brutal places. They know they don't want them to be country clubs, and they don't have a lot of sympathy for prisoners.
Yes.
But if you go and you say, it's in your self-interest to treat these people better, because the great majority are going to return to the community, and you better ask yourself if it's more likely that they will create crime, or is it less likely they will be recidivists because of the treatment they received in prison. Some people say, well, the worse the better, will scare them straight. They'll never want to
Doesn't
go
work.
back to that environment.
Doesn't work.
But that doesn't work. People need to leave prison, it seems to me, and I don't claim to have the experience many of you have, with more tools for reintegration, whether it's to learn how to read,
Exactly.
with some kind of education, with some chance of getting a job, and at least being psychologically prepared to be with their family again, to be in the community. And I know that takes an effort. I'm sure it takes some kind of program, but in the long run, it's probably cheaper than just sending them back to jail for another 10 years, and certainly less cynical. But that's the argument that has to be made. To base it on simply humanitarian grounds is not
not
going to
enough.
cut deeply enough with our fellow citizens.
Well, it
I'm
seems
sorry
to me
say.
that's
That's
a
very
sad
sad,
thing.
but that's my
but the-
understanding.
But to approach it from an economic, I mean, this is what I've learned in my experience, is that when you deal with people from an economic point of view, when they look at the bottom line, they say it is more economically feasible to do this than this. That seems to work in almost all areas of our life, except in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
So something else is operative
Well,
there.
there is.
Our state is considering enacting the death penalty, not because there's been such a public hue for it, but because our particular governor, Governor Cellucci, wants us to have it for reasons of his own. We're looking at paying between $2 and $8 million per execution. But yet, this doesn't seem to faze anybody that old people can't afford drugs to keep them alive because their insurance won't pay for it.
Let me
You're
interrupt
right,
for
though,
just a
Renee.
moment.
Oh, sorry.
Just to let our viewers know that if you want to join our conversation, you can give us a call at 628-9876. Go ahead, Phil.
You're right, Renee. I mean, it seems as if people are just not willing to listen to what appears to be very reasonable. I mean, it makes more sense to give someone an education so they won't go out and commit more crimes than to lock them in a cell and just making them bitter and angry and not really caring about their lives and what they may do with them. But I think there's so much anger out there that somebody hears that and they say, I don't buy that. Why should they get a college education when I couldn't? You know, and I just
I
think
see that
somehow
point.
we got to cut through that anger. And Josh, I'm going to take issue with you a little bit. People people, you're right. You know, a lot of times they're going to respond, they deserve it. Whatever it is, they
Right.
deserve it. But at the same time, I think no one really thinks. If you ask a person, do you believe prisoners should be tortured? They're going to say no.
Right.
So we need to figure out a way to cut through the disinformation that's getting out there. In fact, prisoners are torture. Segregation, long term, is torture. People turn into people who can't function anymore.
Many
They're
commit suicide
diminished
also.
on a permanent basis, and in the meantime, you know, they suffer awfully.
Well, there's the illusion about who is segregated. I mean, there are prisoners who are violent. There are prisoners who are threats to other prisoners. And no one is saying the administration has no right to
Right.
segregate those particular prisoners. But it seems, as others have
Silence
said,
of the lambs.
that there are, you know, that these are very few, relatively
Right.
speaking, and that there's an overclassification of prisoners into these segregated units, into these highly isolated units who don't belong there, and certainly not for the long term. And that's where there needs to be greater attention paid. And that's where the regulations of the state may in fact be all right. They may in fact, I'm not a lawyer, I mean, you look at these things closely
No, if
yourself.
they were
They may
applied,
be, they may,
it would
but
make
the
some
question is
sense.
they're not applied and the courts aren't getting involved, the legislatures aren't interested in monitoring because there's no cry from the public to
Well, you-
treat these people properly.
Well, you
But
know,
there are-
we've talked about a community policing group. You know, I know from guys that I've worked with on the inside about having an oversight committee
Right.
of criminal justice. And a couple of years ago, there was, the governor did have that entity. But they weren't doing anything. They were people who were pulled, handpicked, but they did not necessarily represent advocates or represent people who had a different point of view. And certainly, someone to call attention to that fact. I think it's that whole idea of doing that has died. You know, I'm sorry that it has, but at least at one point, the idea of having a community oversight group was something that had been discussed about by prisoners and
it's-
families of prisoners. And
It's definitely the right concept because, I mean, the idea that police ought to be responsible to the community, has really, become very much accepted, and it's the results have been very dramatic, and yet there's no concept out there that correctional authorities have to be responsible to the community, and in fact they're not. I mean, the policies that are implemented do not assist people in their communities whatsoever, and correctional authorities don't accept the responsibility to enact policies which have a positive impact.
I'll never get a straight answer out of
They
that.
got a call.
I think the other thing that we need to remember is with so many people, particularly going through the Massachusetts system, I personally believe that going to prison is going to lose somewhat of the mark of Cain. I know for every woman in MCI Framingham, she did not fall out of the sky and land there. She has a mother, she has a father, brothers and sisters, children, husbands, boyfriends, and I think that you need to reach out to each one of those.
All right. I think we have a phone call. Let's see if we can get it here. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, Charlie.
Yeah.
This is Jim Dunn.
Hi, Jim.
I've been listening to the program, and I'd like your panel to address, if possible, a larger issue, because everything that everyone's saying is absolutely true, and what seems to come out most strongly is that people really aren't willing to listen to all this. And that's not by accident. We have a whole demonization of certain groups of the population, black, non-English speaking, in COP programs, for instance. There's this sort of long, arbitrary war on certain kinds of drugs that affect particular elements of the society. So there's this sort of larger social framework, that's changed since, say, 1972, when things in prisons were, a little better than they are now anyways. They seem to be headed in a better direction. But there's this movement towards mythologizing and propagandizing the society in a way that goes hand in glove with the shift in wealth. And where is all this going? And it doesn't seem like the common person is making the decisions, and they're not really the person to address maybe. The people who are making the decisions are the people who are interested in mythologizing and propagandizing this great shift in wealth that's taken place. So I just want to throw that out there, and I'll hang up, okay?
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, bye.
Even though it's not the common people who make the decision, but by being quiet and letting the legislators make the decision, they give, because I was listening to Sister Helen Fijon this morning. I was up in New Hampshire. She was speaking, and she was talking about some legislators that she had spoken to. And they told her, well, I wouldn't be for the death penalty, but this, like what you were talking about, Phil, this is what the people want, and the people are quiet. The people aren't saying anything. And that's what well, I have to run on this tough on crime ticket so the people will vote for me. But the people have to, like the college, people have to get in the streets and make some noise. The only way change comes about in this country that we've seen since the beginning is if people are out in the streets protesting about it. If they don't, nothing's going to change. It's going to get worse. They're going to have half this country is going to be locked up, and the other half are going to be keeping them locked up.
Well, I think as we move towards more of those individuals being locked up, that voice is going to have to emerge, because that is going to have, it's already having a profound impact upon families. I've worked with mothers over the last couple of years, and while we've basically been a small group, I say if there are 21,000 prisoners and more in the facilities, that means there are 21,000 mothers, or the potential for that many mothers or stepmothers or someone out there to begin to raise.
Represents a huge population.
That, exactly. It represents a significant voting bloc, and it represents a significant voice to say, what is happening to our loved ones? One of the things that I have often said, approached corrections around, is that when we visit, we're often told that is a privilege. It is not a right. I don't think that's ever been challenged in the court, and I've had some discussion with people at MCLS at one point about the fact that if I don't have a right as a mother, I have a right as a citizen of this commonwealth. And that if I can attack it at that point of view, then let me attack it from the point of view of being a citizen. As a citizen, I do have rights that are guaranteed not only under the Constitution of the Commonwealth, but also under the United States Constitution. I don't think we've really looked at that in a very focused way about our rights as parents.
One of the things that disturbs me is that in talking to people before the show, I wanted to see if there was any videotape or film about the conditions in prisons, and I found out that since 1972 or something like that, they haven't allowed cameras in the prisons. It seems to me that as a member of the public, it's my right to be able to find out what's going on
Charlie,
inside a public
you
institution.
can't smoke in prison because it's, quote, a public building under the law. And you can't have political action committees there either because, quote, they're public buildings. But you or any member of the public, you have my blessing if you try to go in there.
That's right. You
Yes,
don't have
you
a right
have my
to do
blessing.
that.
I remember when MCI Framingham, when Superintendent Schimmel left and Superintendent Guarino came, they had a media day, except they made like the woman who had lost her leg due to their non-treatment of her diabetes had to stay in a unit, and the other woman who needed a double hip replacement, which the DOC refused to give her, was also locked. So it was a very controlled media day, and really
It
was.
has been since
It has been.
since about 1992 or 93. Yes.
I think before then.
Before then.
Yeah,
Well,
the 90s before.
I'm remembering my experience with MCI Framingham and,
Yes,
and
what
some
a
of
screwy
those.
place.
Some of those.
But I think that the right in this country learned really well how to control the media. And
They own the media. They
yeah,
don't need to
but I
control
mean,
it.
but I
They
mean,
own it.
before they always owned it. But before they would show a lot during, like, say, the Vietnam War and whatnot. They don't show stuff
They
anymore.
don't show stuff
You know,
anymore.
it's just like when Salucci had his thing.
Free Mumia?
Yeah,
Free
and people was
Mumia.
talking about Free Mumia.
Salute
They
you.
cut it out. They said, we didn't mean to show you that.
Yes, we didn't mean to show you
missed
You
that.
that.
know? I
Well,
mean,
and also, I mean, you look at like the standard article in the Boston Globe, and which is the liberal paper in town, right? And I mean, I've been involved in many of these and closely monitored how they report these issues. And the standard pattern is the Department of Corrections position is on above the fold or on the first page before you turn inside. And then towards the end of the article, you'll hear the loyal opposition will have its piece. You know, whoever gets to that portion, you know, we'll see that. But it's very slanted. If you count the number of lines supporting the department's position as opposed to the opposition's position, it's always very slanted. And I mean, that's the liberal paper. I mean, then you have Howie Carr, you know, who gets inside information in violation of state privacy law. He has to all the time, and enjoys a wide readership. I mean, it's very
And it's closed
it's
down
very
some
hard to get our
programs
message
at
out.
MCI Norfolk a number of years ago because of his.
I want to let you know that we only have a little less than 2 minutes to go. But I also wanted to ask you, Phil, I mean, does the public not have a right to this kind of information? Do we not have a right to be able to go into prisons?
Well, unfortunately, you know, if you're speaking from a dry legal perspective as opposed to a moral or you know, social, what's socially appropriate perspective, you know, the pendulum has been swinging towards the right legally for many years now, and it's continuing in that direction. And in fact, correctional authorities can do pretty much what they want. You know, despite this prevailing sentiment that somehow the courts are hampering law enforcement, and in fact, you know, it's quite the opposite. There's a complete hands-off policy, to the point where the SJC, in a case that Barbara mentioned earlier, you know, recently said that, you know, a psychiatrist's view on what's cruel and unusual punishment is not even relevant, you know, to, and the court isn't even going to look closely at that. You know.
Hey, last words, we only have less than
Wasn't
a
that
minute.
going to the Supreme Court of the
Pardon?
United States?
It's, well, might.
It might. Good.
Well, the last word is that it's a grave situation and the public is either willfully ignorant of what's going on or is afraid to ask, and that there's no political leadership articulate enough and brave enough to point the finger at these situations and take the political heat in order to effect change, and that we're looking for new levers in order to defend these people properly.
All right.
And Amnesty's involvement is very welcomed by those of us who have been struggling on
Absolutely.
a sort of a
Absolutely.
national or statewide
Absolutely.
level.
Well, because it brings an
Because
international
right.
perspective, and I think that is important.
Important. I
The whole
think-
world is watching.
People like to think that this country is, like you started out saying, better somehow than other nations. And I think we need to learn that if we're better, it's not by much.
All right.
I would say
There's
not.
room
It's
for
more
improvement,
racist.
yeah.
It's
All
more
right.
racist.
That's all we have time for tonight.
That's what it
Thank you,
is.
Charlie.
Thank you all very
Thank
much
you.
for coming.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Charlie.
All right.
Thank you.
And good night.